I was 34 the summer I decided to camp overnight in an old graveyard just outside of Marlow, a quiet town in eastern Nebraska. It wasn't something I planned far ahead. It just came to me while driving back from a solo hiking trip in Montana. I'd taken 2 weeks off work and was slowly making my way back home to Kansas City. I wanted one last strange story to remember before going back to my cubicle. I'd seen a post online a few months back about a guy who camped in weird places, abandoned buildings, rooftops in cities, old fairgrounds. One picture stuck in my head: a tent set up right in the middle of a field of crooked headstones. Something about it was eerie but peaceful. I thought, why not? I had all my gear in the trunk, no one waiting on me at home, and a full tank of gas. I just needed a place off the map. Marlow didn't even show up in my GPS until I zoomed way in. I stopped there around 4 p.m. on a Thursday. The town was small, really small. Maybe 20 houses, a grain elevator, a gas station with one pump, and a diner that looked like it hadn't had a new coat of paint since the 70s. I got a burger and fries to go, ate them in the car, then looked up cemetery on the paper map I kept in the glove box. It wasn't even labeled, but a gray square about 2 miles out of town looked promising. I figured that had to be it. I drove down a gravel road lined with dry corn stalks and a few rotting fence posts. Eventually, I saw a rusted metal gate hanging off one hinge. Behind it, a patch of flat land with a bunch of weathered stones scattered like broken teeth. I pulled over onto the grass and stepped out. It was hot, dry, and dead quiet.
No birds.
No wind, just the ticking sound of my car engine cooling. I stood at the gate for a while, just looking in. Some stones were tilted so far over they were almost flat on the ground. Others were completely covered in weeds. I saw one tree in the whole place, a cottonwood growing near the back. The fence was mostly gone, just rusted wires and a few leaning posts left standing. I walked in slowly, trying not to step directly on graves, even though most of the markers were unreadable. The ones I could read were old, really old. 1910, 1894, 1871. No new ones. I guess no one had been buried here in at least 70 years. That was perfect. No visitors, no kids messing around, no chance of someone coming by at night. I picked a flat patch near the tree and set up my tent. It was just a small one-person thing, olive green, the kind backpackers use. I kept my sleeping pad and bag inside it, but left the flap open for air. I had enough water, a couple protein bars, and a flashlight with fresh batteries. I left my phone in airplane mode. There wasn't any signal out there anyway. By the time I finished setting everything up, the sun was low and turning orange. The shadows stretched long between the graves. I sat on the ground with my back against the tree and just watched the light fade. I wasn't scared. I was more curious than anything else. Curious what it would feel like to fall asleep surrounded by the dead. As it got darker, I noticed how empty the place felt. Not just quiet, *empty star. I didn't hear crickets or frogs. No far-off engines or barking dogs. Not even the hum of insects. Just the soft rustle of leaves when the wind moved. It was like the air was holding its breath. I got up to stretch and walked a slow circle around the cemetery. I didn't have a headlamp, just my flashlight, and I kept it low to the ground. The beam lit up chunks of broken stone and brittle weeds. One stone near the middle caught my eye. It was newer than the others, probably from the 1950s, and had a chain link border around it. The name was partially chipped away, but I could make out Wilkes. No birth date, just died 1956. That was it. I stood there for a minute just staring at it, wondering who they were and why the grave looked more recent than the rest. The chain was rusted but still intact. Someone must have cared enough to put it there back then. I moved on, not thinking much of it at the time. Back at my tent, I sat for a while and ate one of the bars. The stars came out thick and clear. It was beautiful in a weird kind of way. I didn't even need a lantern. The moon was almost full, and the sky was cloudless. I climbed into my sleeping bag around 10 p.m., left the flap half open for airflow, and lay there listening to the wind. I think I dozed off around 11, but I woke up again just after midnight. I didn't know what woke me. No sound, no light, no dream I could remember, just a sudden feeling of being alert. I sat up inside the tent and listened. Nothing, still dead quiet. I leaned out of the tent and looked around. The graves were bathed in moonlight. The wind had stopped completely. The silence was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. I waited for a while, then lay back down. I was tired, but something was off. Couldn't shake it. Maybe 15 minutes later, I heard something. It was faint, just a soft crack like a dry stick breaking. I froze. It had come from the far side of the cemetery, near the gate. I held my breath and listened. A few seconds passed. Then another crack. Then a shuffling noise. Slow, uneven, like someone walking through tall grass with a limp. I turned off my flashlight and waited in the dark. My heart was racing. I strained my ears, trying to figure out if it was an animal. But the steps were too slow, deliberate, not skittish like a deer, not heavy like a cow. I heard another step, then another, then nothing. I stayed in my tent for what felt like forever, barely breathing. I didn't move. The flap was still half open, but I couldn't see anything, just the edge of a grave a few feet away. Then I heard something else, a metal clinking sound, like chain on chain. The Wilkes grave. I thought of that chain link border. I knew exactly where it was, maybe 40 feet from my tent, and whatever I was hearing was right next to it. I felt the blood drain from my face. I slowly, carefully zipped the flap shut. It was pointless, really. A tent isn't protection. It's just fabric. But I felt better not being seen. I lay down flat and tried to steady my breathing. I was wide awake. I couldn't tell how long I stayed like that, but the noises stopped after a while. The steps, the metal sound, everything. Silence returned, but I didn't trust it. I didn't sleep. I just waited for the sun. At first light, I unzipped the tent and looked out. Everything looked exactly the same. Peaceful, calm, dry grass, leaning stones, golden sunlight coming through the leaves. I crawled out, stretched, and walked over to the Wilkes grave. The chain had been moved. It wasn't much, but I could tell. One section had been unhooked and was lying on the ground. The grass under it was bent differently than the rest. And near one of the corner posts, there was a footprint. A single boot print. Not mine. Too wide. I stood there for a while, heart pounding again. I looked around the cemetery, but saw nothing else out of place. I checked the fence line, walked the perimeter. No cars.
No trash.
No signs anyone had been there, but someone had. Back at my tent, I packed everything fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop, just shoved everything in my duffel and headed straight to the car. I didn't look back until I was on the road again. When I did, I saw something that still gives me chills. There was someone standing at the edge of the cemetery, near the gate. I could barely see them, just a dark figure in the morning sun, too far to make out their face. They weren't moving, just standing there watching. I drove faster. I didn't stop in Marlow. I didn't stop until I hit the next town with a police station. I didn't report it, though. What would I even say? Someone stood near a grave while I was camping? Nothing illegal about that. But I did ask the clerk at the gas station if they knew anything about the cemetery outside Marlow. They shrugged, said it was closed down a long time ago. No one maintained it. Most folks didn't even know it was there. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a local. Maybe they saw my car and got curious. But I couldn't explain the footprints, or the chain, or why they'd come in the middle of the night, without a light, moving slow, dragging their foot. I never went back to get answers. I didn't want them. I kept driving back home to Kansas City. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while, just tried to forget. But sometimes I dream about it, about the slow steps, the silence, the figure by the gate. And every time I do, I wonder what would have happened if I'd left the tent, if I'd shined my flashlight in their direction, if I'd gotten out and said something. But I didn't. I just lay still in the dark, holding my breath, hoping they'd go away. And they did, but not before they saw me. My name is Eric Walters. I'm 34 years old, and this happened back in the late summer of 2021. I live in Pennsylvania, but that year I decided to take a solo camping trip up north, not too far from the edge of the Adirondacks in upstate New York. I had some time off from work, and I needed a break from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of everything in my life. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I'd gone camping a few times before, but this trip was different. I wasn't looking for a family-friendly campground with bathrooms and showers. I wanted something further out, off the map almost. I'd read about a spot called Timber Hollow in an old hiking forum online. Not many posts mentioned it. Apparently, it was just inside a stretch of thick forest that used to be logging land a few decades ago, but had since been mostly abandoned and reclaimed by nature. There were no marked trails, no campgrounds, and certainly no amenities. It was the kind of place you could only find if you knew where to look, and even then, you had to hike in on your own. The kind of place people passed over because it was too out of the way or not pretty enough for Instagram. That's exactly what I wanted. I drove up in my old Subaru, packed with a decent tent, a sleeping bag, a basic cooking setup, and enough food and water for 4 days. I had my Garmin GPS device with offline maps, a topo map, and a printed guide from the forum that described how to get to Timber Hollow. It wasn't much, just a few notes about a rusted gate, a dry creek bed, and the angle of the old logging road that curved away from a hunting shack. But it was enough. I parked my car on the shoulder of an overgrown service road and hiked in with my gear strapped tight to my back. Took me over 3 hours to get there. The trail wasn't really a trail, it was more of a suggestion made by years of occasional foot traffic. You could barely see it in places, but I followed the instructions, used the landmarks, and eventually made it to the hollow. It was a wide, low-lying stretch of forest with a natural clearing that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. Pines and oaks surrounded the space, and there was a flat section perfect for pitching my tent. No signs of litter or fire rings. No other people. No sounds but the wind through the trees. The first night was peaceful. The air smelled like pine needles and damp moss. I set up camp, boiled water for some freeze-dried beef stew, and sat watching the light fade behind the trees. There's something satisfying about cooking over a flame and eating right out of a pouch while the temperature drops and the bugs start to disappear. I turned in early, using a small solar lantern and slipping into my sleeping bag as the night deepened. It was quiet, really quiet. No cars, no planes overhead, no distant music or voices. Just wind and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the brush. But the second night was when things started to feel wrong. The day had gone fine. I'd spent the morning hiking around the hollow, checking out the terrain, and trying to get a sense of how big the area really was. I found what looked like the remains of an old logging bridge over a shallow gully. Just some beams and rotted planks now. There were a few animal tracks in the mud near the edges of the streambed. Mostly deer, maybe a raccoon. Normal stuff. I came back to camp around 4 p.m., made some tea, and sat with my back against a tree reading a paperback I'd brought. The sun had dropped lower when I started to feel like I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it. Just that feeling you get when someone's behind you, even if you don't hear or see anything. First, I ignored it. My rational brain told me it was just the isolation getting to me. But that didn't stop the hairs on my arms from rising. I got up and slowly looked around. Nothing out of the ordinary.
No noises.
No movement, but the feeling didn't go away. I walked the perimeter of my camp, making sure nothing had been disturbed. My food was still sealed in its bear canister, my backpack untouched, and my gear in place. But my gut wouldn't settle. That night, after dinner, I kept my lantern on longer than usual. I didn't want to be in total darkness. I sat outside the tent with my back to a large tree and listened. It was cooler than the night before, and the air had that stillness that makes sound travel farther. Around 11 p.m., I heard something. It wasn't close, at least not at first, but it was movement. Not the small scurry of a squirrel or the padded steps of a deer. This was heavier, more deliberate, something bipedal, something walking through the forest. The rhythm of the steps was wrong for a four-legged animal. Too spaced out. I froze and held my breath, counting the seconds between each step. They were distant, maybe 100 yards off, but coming from the direction of the gully I'd explored earlier. I turned off the lantern, my eyes adjusting to the faint moonlight, and waited. The steps paused for a long moment. Then they started again, a little closer this time. I stayed still, completely silent, straining to hear. Then the steps stopped again. I didn't hear anything for at least 10 minutes. I stayed there until almost 1 a.m., shivering slightly in the cool night air, until I finally crawled into my tent and zipped the flap. I didn't sleep much. Every tiny sound outside made me jerk awake. By morning, I was exhausted. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had gotten lost and was looking for a route back to a trail. Maybe they had seen my lantern and were moving toward it before realizing I was there. That was the most reasonable explanation, and I clung to it. But that gut feeling was still there. The feeling that something was off. I made a decision to pack up camp and leave a day early. I just didn't feel safe anymore. I started breaking everything down after a quick breakfast and loaded up my gear. As I was securing the last of my food into the pack, I noticed something on a nearby tree. It was a mark carved into the bark. A clean line about chest high, running vertical with a second, shorter cut crossing it near the top. Like a crude T. I was absolutely sure it hadn't been there when I set up camp. I would have noticed. I checked a few of the surrounding trees, and 3 more had similar marks, some fresher than others. It was like someone had been quietly moving around my camp during the night, marking the trees. I stopped everything and stood completely still. My breathing was shallow. My ears were ringing from the silence. I scanned the trees, my eyes darting from trunk to trunk, expecting to see movement. Nothing. I didn't even finish my coffee. I slung the pack over my shoulder and started back the way I came. The same trail, the same landmarks, but somehow everything looked different. The air felt thicker. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone or something coming up from the hollow. About halfway out, I reached the dry creek bed that marked the turn toward the rusted gate. As I climbed down into it, I spotted something wedged under a bush near the bank. It was a boot, an old, muddy hiking boot with frayed laces and a worn sole. It didn't look like it had been there long. The area around it had fresh prints, some leading toward the hollow and others back out. I didn't stop to investigate. I kept walking, faster this time. I felt eyes on me, even though I never heard another step. I never saw a figure, but I could feel the presence of someone, like a weight on the back of my neck. When I finally reached my car, I didn't stop to change out of my hiking clothes or check my phone. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I drove until I hit a small gas station off Route 30 and pulled in to fill up. That's when I finally looked in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes bloodshot. I hadn't realized just how tense I'd been. But more than that, something was bothering me. I opened the trunk to double-check my gear and noticed something small wedged into the mesh of my backpack, near the outer pouch. It was a stick, just a stick, but someone had carved a symbol into it, the same crude T I'd seen on the trees. I threw it into the trash and drove straight home. I never reported what happened. What would I have said? That someone had been following me through the woods, marking trees around my camp and leaving symbols? There was no crime.
No confrontación.
Just fear. Slow, creeping fear. I haven't gone back to Timber Hollow. I haven't gone camping since. But sometimes, when I'm walking alone through a wooded park or driving past a dense stretch of trees, I still get that feeling. The feeling that someone is watching. That maybe the woods didn't want me there. That maybe, just maybe, I was warned, and I listened. It was late September of 2021 when I decided to take a week off work and head out to the mountains in northern Idaho with my dog, Max. I was 32 at the time, burnt out from my job in construction management, and needed some quiet away from the city noise and stress. I'd been hiking and camping since I was a teenager, and I'd taken Max with me on most of my trips since I got him 4 years ago. He was a German Shepherd mix, loyal and smart, always alert. I trusted him more than I trusted most people. I picked a place I'd never been before, an old forest area near a spot called Quartz Lake. It wasn't a popular site, which was exactly what I wanted. Just dense pine woods, dirt trails, and empty space. I found it through a hiking forum online. Someone had mentioned it in a buried thread and said it was peaceful and overlooked. I loaded my truck with gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, first aid kit, stove, water jugs, and all the usual stuff. I packed enough for 6 nights. I didn't plan on seeing anyone out there, but I brought my Glock 19 anyway. Not because I expected trouble from people, but because animals don't care if you're a good guy or not. I had bear spray too, just in case. The drive took most of the day. I got off the highway and followed a forest road for about 25 miles. It was rough and narrow, full of dips and rocks. I had to slow down to a crawl near the end. The trees were thick and grew right up to the edge of the road, and branches brushed the truck every so often. I passed no other cars. That part didn't bother me. I'd done solo trips plenty of times. I found a clearing about a half-mile from the lake. The spot was flat and dry, with enough space for the tent and a small fire. There were signs that someone had camped there before. A blackened fire ring made of stones and a few old beer cans half buried in pine needles. But it looked like no one had been here in years. I set up camp by late afternoon. Max was already roaming the edges of the clearing, nose to the ground, tail up. The air smelled like pine sap and dirt, and it was quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind in the branches. That first night was calm. The stars came out bright, and I cooked some beans and rice over the stove while Max gnawed on a chew bone. I didn't bother with a fire. I wasn't cold, and I didn't want to draw attention. I sat by the tent in my camp chair, listening to the silence. Max lay beside me, ears up, eyes flicking toward the trees now and then. At one point, I heard something move deeper in the woods, just a branch cracking, maybe 30 or 40 yards off. Max sat up right away and looked in that direction. His ears pointed forward. I stood and scanned with my flashlight. Nothing. No eye shine. No movement. Nothing unusual. Probably just a deer. I went to bed around 10. The ground was cold and hard, even with the pad under my sleeping bag. Max curled up near my feet inside the tent. I didn't sleep great, but that's normal the first night out. The next morning, I woke up to Max whining. It was still dark. I checked my watch, 5:12 a.m. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was freezing. Max darted outside ahead of me and started sniffing the ground with his tail stiff. There were tracks near the edge of the clearing. Not human and not a deer either. Big, wide prints with claws. Bear, I guessed, but they were old. The edges had crumbled. Still, Max was on edge for the rest of the morning. He kept checking the trees and growled low once or twice at nothing I could see. That afternoon, I took a hike with him down to the lake. It was only a half-mile, and the trail followed a stream. The lake was beautiful, clear, still, ringed with pine trees all around. No one else was there. I sat on a rock and watched the water while Max drank from the edge. We stayed for a couple of hours, and then I headed back before it got dark. When I returned, I noticed something was off. The folding shovel I kept near the fire ring was missing. I looked all over the clearing for it. I was sure I hadn't moved it. It wasn't a big deal, just a $15 tool, but it was strange. I figured maybe I'd left it out and an animal had dragged it off. I looked for marks or tracks and found a few small ones. Raccoon maybe, or some other small animal. But it was odd that they would take the shovel and nothing else. That night, I made a fire just to feel more comfortable. Max stayed closer to me than usual. He kept staring into the woods. I didn't see or hear anything, but he was restless. I turned in early again. I kept the Glock inside the tent, safety on but within arm's reach. At around 1:30 a.m., I woke up. Max was growling, not loud, but deep in his throat. I sat up, heart pounding. I could hear something moving outside the tent. Slow, deliberate steps. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Max barked once, sharp and loud. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent partway. I shined the beam through the mesh. Nothing. Then the noise stopped. Just dead silence. Max was stiff, hackles up, staring at the flap. I stayed frozen like that for a few minutes, listening, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I calmed Max down and lay back down, but I didn't sleep much. Every little noise outside made my pulse jump. In the morning, I checked the clearing again. No prints, no broken branches, no sign of anything. The forest can play tricks on your ears at night. Maybe it was just a deer again or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing just outside my tent, watching. On the third day, I decided to hike further out, to a ridge a couple miles north. Max was calmer once we were away from camp. We hiked for a few hours, following game trails and dry creek beds. We didn't see any animals, but I did find a set of boot prints at one point in a muddy patch under some trees. They weren't mine. I stopped and stared at them. Just two prints, side by side, heading off into thicker brush. No tread pattern, just flat-soled, like work boots or older hiking boots. The prints were fresh, maybe a day old. It gave me an uneasy feeling. I looked around and listened. Still nothing. Max was sniffing the ground, but he didn't seem alarmed. I marked the spot in my head and decided to loop back toward camp. That evening, I kept the fire going later. Max sat closer than ever, barely eating. When I got into the tent, I left the rainfly pulled halfway back so I could see the sky and scan the trees. I don't know what time it was, but I woke up to footsteps again. Slow. Crunch. Stop. Crunch. Max lunged toward the door and barked loud and wild this time. I grabbed the flashlight and the gun and unzipped the flap just enough to look out. I swept the light through the trees. Nothing. Then I caught a flash movement, just past the reach of the beam. I held my breath and aimed the light again. I saw someone, a man. He was standing behind a tree, just half visible. Thin, wearing a hooded jacket. He ducked behind the trunk when the light hit him. I froze. Max went berserk. I stepped out of the tent, gun in one hand, light in the other. I yelled into the woods. Nothing. No answer. I circled the fire pit and scanned the whole tree line. No one. After 5 minutes of tense silence, I went back into the tent and waited out the night with the Glock in my lap. Max stayed at the flap, ears up, eyes fixed outside. To first light, I packed everything. Fast. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't take down the fire ring. I just rolled the tent, stuffed my gear, and loaded the truck. I kept the Glock in my waistband and Max in the passenger seat. I drove back down the road, faster than I should have, but I didn't care. I checked my mirrors constantly, never saw anyone. I didn't stop until I hit the highway again. Even then, I kept driving for another 2 hours before pulling over to breathe. Looking back, I don't know what that guy wanted. Maybe he was just some hermit or hiker who didn't like me in his woods. Maybe he was watching me the whole time, waiting. I don't know, but I haven't gone back to that part of Idaho since. Max was never the same after that trip. He got more protective, more watchful, even around people he used to know. Me too, I guess. That trip changed something in both of us. It reminded me that the scariest things out in the woods aren't bears or storms. It's people. People who don't want to be found. People who don't care if you're alone, unarmed, or far from help. And the worst part? They don't make noise. They don't need to say a word. They just watch. It was early October 2013. I was 29 years old, living in Salt Lake City, Utah. I worked long weeks in construction and rarely took time off. That fall, I finally took 3 days off after a big project ended, and I decided to go camping by myself. I'd done solo trips before, mostly up near Bear Lake or down in Moab, but this time I wanted something quieter, somewhere a little less busy. I ended up picking a spot out near the Grand Staircase Escalante area, deep in southern Utah. It's rugged, dry country, red rocks, narrow canyons, almost Martian-looking in spots. I had only been there once years earlier with my uncle and remembered it being dead silent at night. That was what I wanted. Silence and to be left alone. I had a brown Tacoma pickup, old but still reliable. I loaded it with the usual gear: tent, food, cooler, a couple gallons of water, my old bolt-action rifle just in case I needed it. I don't hunt anymore, but I always bring it when I'm in remote places. Not because of animals, because of people. That part of Utah stretches far in all directions. You can go hours without seeing anyone, and there are dozens of narrow dirt roads cutting through scrub and sandstone. Places where a truck could vanish into a wash and no one would ever find it. I left early on a Wednesday morning, aiming to be deep into the canyons before dark. I took Highway 12 south, passing through Tropic and Cannonville, then turned off onto a narrow dirt road that led into the National Monument. After an hour on that bumpy road, I reached a small, semi-flattened area tucked beside a wall of tan sandstone. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I'd marked on a map after doing some research online. From there, I could hike into several nearby slot canyons without seeing another soul. No cell signal, no fences, no RVs. Perfect. I set up camp just as the sun dipped behind the cliffs. It got dark fast, and the air turned cold. I built a small fire, warmed up some canned chili, and sat on my folding chair with a headlamp on, reading an old paperback. The quiet was thick. No cars, no voices, just wind brushing through junipers and dry grass. Occasionally, a rock shifted in the cooling air or a bird fluttered in a bush nearby, but nothing unusual. Sometime around 9:30, I heard what I thought was a coyote howl, far off in the distance. Not strange at all. I've heard plenty, but then I heard a second one much closer. It was sharp and drawn out. Not a dog, but not quite a coyote either. Something about the tone was off. Too long, too deliberate. I listened hard, but it didn't come again. Still, it made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't sleep well that night. Even inside my tent with the rifle close by, I kept waking up every hour or so. Once, I thought I heard footsteps on gravel, but when I sat up and listened, I heard nothing. I figured it was just my brain playing tricks. That happens in remote places. You're not used to the silence, and your mind fills in the gaps. The next morning, I made coffee and eggs over the fire and tried to shake off the weird feeling. I set out on a hike around 10, heading down into a narrow canyon nearby. The light down there was gold and orange, and the walls were high enough that I didn't see the sky for long stretches. The air felt still and cool, and my boots crunched against sand and pebbles with every step. It was beautiful, empty, quiet, the kind of place that made me feel small in the best way. I hiked about 4 miles down and then looped around back up through a different slot. I returned to camp around 3 p.m., legs tired, sunburned a bit on my neck. My truck was just as I left it, but one thing was different. The cooler had been moved, just a few feet, but I noticed immediately. I had left it next to the fire ring, and now it was leaning against the tent. The lid was still latched shut, but the position was wrong. I checked inside. Everything was there, nothing missing, but someone had definitely been there. There weren't any clear boot prints. The ground was mostly rock and hard-packed sand, but I saw a mark near the tent, a smear of dirt like something had been dragged lightly. No animal would move a heavy cooler like that and then leave the food, and no animal would move it without opening it. I stood there, staring at the mark for a while, listening. It was the middle of the day, bright and open, but I still felt watched. I walked the area around my site for maybe 20 minutes, making wide circles, looking for any sign someone had passed through. Cigarette butts, trash, prints, anything. But I found nothing, just dry brush, flat rock, and the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept the rifle out after that, didn't keep it in the case. I leaned it against my chair while I cooked dinner, glancing over my shoulder more often than I usually would. I didn't build a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. Instead, I sat in the dark, eating cold beans from the can and sipping warm water. I didn't read. I just listened. At some point, probably close to midnight, I heard footsteps. Not animal ones, human ones, crunching carefully over sand and rock. I was laying in my tent, fully awake, rifle beside me, heart beating fast. The steps were maybe 30 feet from my tent, slow and irregular, like someone walking in circles or checking something out. I held my breath, straining to hear more. Then I heard a low, drawn-out whistle. 2 notes, soft and slow. I sat up, unzipped the tent silently, and peeked out. The moon was out, casting a pale glow over the site. I didn't see anything. No movement. I waited. After a minute, the footsteps faded. Nothing else came. I stayed up till morning. By daylight, I searched again. This time, I found something. A spot behind a boulder maybe 50 yards from my tent where someone had clearly stood or squatted. The sand was disturbed, and there was a partial print, barefoot, toes and all. Not huge, but adult-sized. Who the hell hikes barefoot out here? The ground is rough, covered in cactus and sharp rock. I packed up fast. My plan was to stay 2 more nights, but that was out the window. Something wasn't right. I got in my truck and headed back down the dirt road, moving slow over the bumps. After about 2 miles, I noticed something in the rear view. A man, walking in the road, shirtless, dirty, just walking straight down the middle. I stopped the truck, watched him for a second. He wasn't carrying anything, just moving slowly, not waving, not reacting. I didn't get out. I just watched. He never turned or looked toward me, just kept walking. Eventually, I put the truck in gear and pulled away. I didn't look back. I stopped at the first town I hit, Escalante, and found a cheap motel. I didn't sleep well even there. I couldn't stop thinking about the print, the moved cooler, the footsteps, the man in the road. Felt like something out of a nightmare, but it was real, all of it. A few days later, I talked to a friend of mine who used to work search and rescue in southern Utah. I told him the story. He got quiet, then said, "Yeah, there's weird stuff out that way. Every now and then, someone goes missing. Most of the time, it's dehydration, falls. But sometimes it's not." He mentioned a rumor, one I had heard before but never paid attention to: skinwalkers. Old Navajo stories about people who can take animal shapes, who live in the deep canyons and shadow places. I don't believe in that stuff. I don't believe in magic or monsters. But the thing is, whether you call it a skinwalker or just a man who's gone feral, living in the rocks, it doesn't matter. There was something out there, someone, watching, and whoever they were, they didn't want me there. I never went back to that part of Utah. I still camp, but I stick to more traveled areas now. I've got a family, a house, a life I'm not willing to risk for solitude anymore. I still think about those nights often, though, about how close someone got to my tent, how they moved my things, watched me sleep. The worst part is not knowing their face. I never saw it, just the barefoot print and a shadow of a man walking alone on a dirt road, miles from anywhere. Not a ghost, not a monster, just a person. And that's what still scares me the most. It was late summer 2018 when I decided to take some time off and travel solo through parts of southern France. I had just turned 29 that May, living in Manchester at the time, working remotely in tech. I'd always preferred cooler, quiet weather, but that year had been particularly stressful. I felt stuck and drained, like I needed to breathe somewhere different for a while. My idea was simple: go alone, unplug, hike a bit, and camp out for a few nights. I wasn't chasing anything special, just peace, space. By early September, I was about 2 weeks into the trip. I'd gone through Bordeaux, stopped off at Toulouse, and then started heading southeast. My plan was to camp a couple of nights in Parc National des Cévennes. I had done my research beforehand, nothing fancy or dangerous. It's not exactly tourist-heavy compared to the Alps or the Riviera. That was the appeal. Old stone villages, forests, quiet trails. On the day, everything went wrong. I'd driven into the mountains near a tiny commune called Le Vigan. I left my rental car on a small gravel pull-off near a bend in the road. There wasn't a proper parking lot or any signs, just a narrow side path that led through thick woods. The trees were dense here, mostly chestnut and oak, with moss clinging to the bark, and a smell of damp leaves that reminded me of early autumn back in the UK. I loaded my gear into my pack: tent, stove, water bladder, sleeping bag, a few basics, and set off. It was early afternoon. I planned on hiking maybe 2 hours, nothing too extreme. I had a general sense of where I was going, marked the car's GPS location on my phone, and even carried a printed map just in case. The trail wasn't really marked, but it had signs of being used. A flattened path through low brush, with occasional broken branches that looked stepped on. For the first hour, it felt exactly like I wanted it to. The quiet was almost total. Just birds, my boots on the dirt, and the steady weight of my pack. A light breeze stirred the treetops, but down on the forest floor, it was still. The sunlight came through in patches, dappled and warm on my shoulders. I remember thinking I'd sleep early, get up before sunrise, and maybe hike further into the woods the next day.
No rush.
Eventually, I found a clearing just off the trail. Flat enough, dry, slightly hidden by a ridge to one side. I dropped my pack, pitched the tent, boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal. I'd done this many times before. I wasn't new to camping. I had everything I needed, kept things neat, and left no trace. After dinner, I wandered a bit, took a few pictures of the fading light, then crawled into the tent just as it was getting dark. It must have been just after 10 p.m. when I first heard something. I was half asleep, lying on my side, half in my bag, scrolling through some downloaded articles on my phone. At first I thought it was just a deer or maybe a boar moving through the woods. The sound was faint, branches shifting, something soft brushing leaves. But then it stopped and started again, closer. I sat up. The tent was zipped shut, the rain fly down, so I couldn't see anything outside. I turned my phone's screen off, listened, nothing. Then, maybe a minute later, I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. 2 quick crunches on dried twigs, deliberate steps. Not an animal. I felt the back of my neck tighten. My fingers were frozen on the phone. I waited. Another minute. Still. Then silence. You learn to ignore a lot when you're alone in the woods. Noises carry. Wind, animals, even your own breath can start playing tricks. I told myself it was just something passing through. Maybe a fox or even another hiker trying to find a place to rest. I kept listening, but after a while it was just the usual night sounds again. An owl in the distance, rustling leaves, nothing out of place. I forced myself to lie back down. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I stepped out early, before the sun had fully risen. The air was cold. I boiled water for coffee and walked a wide circle around my tent, just looking. There weren't any obvious prints or anything strange nearby. If something or someone had been close the night before, they didn't leave a trail. I pushed it out of my mind. After packing up, I decided to hike further east. I'd seen on the map that there was an old stone structure, some kind of abandoned shelter or lookout, about 6 kilometers in. It wasn't marked on most trail maps, but a few hiking forums had mentioned it. I figured I'd check it out, maybe sleep nearby. I had enough supplies for 2 more nights. Took me a little over 2 hours to reach it. The trail narrowed the deeper I went, eventually thinning to little more than patches of flattened grass. When I finally saw the structure, it was almost camouflaged, half covered in ivy, slumped into the hillside. It looked like an old shepherd's hut. 1 door frame, no door, half a roof, stone walls maybe 4 feet high. No one had used it in years. I dropped my gear and looked around. The area felt isolated. Not in a peaceful way this time. It was too quiet. I kept thinking about the noises from the night before. Still, I told myself not to be stupid. I was deep in the woods, but not completely lost. I had GPS. I had a charged power bank. There were people in nearby villages. This wasn't the wild. I camped about 30 meters from the old hut, near a sloped hill that overlooked the forest canopy. That evening, I didn't wander far. I kept everything tight, fire small, gear inside the tent, knife within reach. It was probably nothing, I kept saying, but something was off. Around 9:30 p.m., I saw him. I was sitting near the tent, back against a tree, just watching the sky shift colors. No fire this time, just my headlamp off to preserve night vision. That's when I caught the movement, across the clearing, maybe 15 meters back, near the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was a tree or trick of light, but it moved again. Person, a man, standing behind a tree, not walking, not saying anything, just standing. I froze. Every part of me wanted to bolt, but I stayed still, watching. He wasn't holding anything. I couldn't make out his face. He wore dark clothes, hunched slightly, like he was trying not to be seen, but not well, just visible enough to be noticed. It was almost like he wanted me to see him. I didn't move. We stayed like that, me sitting against the tree, him half hidden, locked in stillness. I don't know how long it was. A minute, maybe less, and then he was gone, just stepped back into the dark trees. No sound.
No footsteps.
I didn't sleep that night. I packed my gear in silence, left the tent up to avoid noise, and sat with my knife in hand, scanning the trees in every direction. The fear wasn't sharp. It was heavy, numbing, like a weight sitting on my chest. I kept thinking, why was he there? There were no other camps, no signs of hikers, no towns nearby. Why wasn't he moving? Watching. At the first light of dawn, I packed everything and left the area fast. I didn't eat, didn't stop, just walked. Backtracked the entire 6 kilometers. My legs were sore, my knees tight, but I kept going. I didn't want to be in that part of the forest anymore. When I reached the car, nothing looked out of place. The gravel lot was just as I'd left it. No signs of anyone else. Still, I locked the doors the moment I got in and didn't stop driving for nearly 2 hours, until I reached a larger village called Florac. I booked a cheap motel room, threw my gear inside, and stood under the hot shower for what felt like an hour. That night, inside the room, I finally allowed myself to breathe, but I couldn't shake the image. His body behind the tree, the stillness, the sense that he wasn't surprised to see me, that he was waiting. I stayed in hotels the rest of the trip. No more camping. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just some local out for a walk or a traveler who'd gotten lost. But deep down, I didn't believe it. I'd been camping for years. I knew the feel of a place, of people. That wasn't someone passing through. I think he followed me. Even now, back home, sometimes I'll be walking through a park or sitting by the window at night, and I'll feel it again. That weight, that silence, the shape of someone just watching. I know it sounds stupid, maybe even paranoid, but I trust my instincts more now. I don't camp alone anymore. I was 33 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the hills outside Eugene, Oregon. It was late October 2019, and I had some time off from work that I didn't want to waste. Life had been heavy lately. Long hours, a recent breakup, and my mind just felt cluttered. I wasn't looking for anything dramatic. Just a couple nights alone, quiet, away from people, with a tent, a fire, some food, and no phone reception. That was all I wanted. Just space to breathe, to think. I picked a spot I'd seen before on a hike. A little clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick trees, about 3 miles off a logging trail. It wasn't part of any campground, just public land out in the middle of nowhere. The place had a kind of tucked away feeling that I liked. No big signs of human activity. No beer cans, no fire pits. Just woods, water, and silence. Felt private. The forecast said rain starting late Friday night and carrying into Saturday afternoon. That didn't bother me much. I had decent gear and liked the sound of rain on a tent. So that Friday morning, I packed my gear into my Subaru Outback, tent, tarp, sleeping bag, camp stove, water, snacks, rain gear, a book, and hit the road. The drive took about an hour and a half. The last part was up a gravel road full of potholes and branches. It had rained earlier that week, and the road was a mess, but I took it slow. By the time I reached the pull-off near the old logging trail, it was past noon. I parked the car on a little flat section just off the road, locked it, strapped on my pack, and started hiking in. The hike wasn't hard, just muddy. The trail dipped downhill for a bit, curved around a rocky slope, and led into a thicker forest where everything smelled wet and green. It was quiet in that deep way you only get in the woods. Even the birds were scarce. About 40 minutes in, I found the clearing. It was just like I remembered. A small open area maybe 30 feet wide, edged by ferns and mossy trunks. The stream was right there, moving slowly but steady over smooth stones. A few thick trees leaned over it, giving a kind of natural canopy. The sound of water was low and constant, like background noise that settled into your bones. I dropped my pack, stood still for a moment, and just listened. Then I got to work. I laid a tarp down over the flattest part of the ground and set up my tent on top of it, double-checking the seams and stakes because of the incoming weather. I tied another tarp up between a couple of trees as a kind of rain shelter so I could cook and sit without getting soaked. After that, I gathered wood. Most of it was damp, but I found a few dry branches under some pines and made a small pile. I even collected some flat stones and built a little fire ring just in case. By the time everything was set up, it was pushing 5. The sky had already gone dim under the clouds. I boiled water for some freeze-dried beef stew and sat on my folding stool under the tarp, eating slowly. The air had that cool, damp bite that creeps in right before real rain starts. I added an extra layer, then walked around a bit, just stretching my legs and taking in the woods. That's when I realized how far I felt from everything. No houses, no road noise, just forest in every direction. And then it started raining. It was soft at first, like a whisper in the leaves, but then it picked up. Not a full downpour, but steady enough to keep everything slick. I ducked under the tarp and watched the drops fall through gaps in the branches. The firewood I hadn't covered was already damp. I knew I wasn't going to get much flame going that night. I crawled into my tent early. The rain got heavier. I read for a while by headlamp, then turned it off and lay there listening. The sound of rain on the fly was constant, almost rhythmic. It made me drowsy. The woods were dark, so dark it felt like the night had weight. I pulled my sleeping bag up to my chin and drifted off, feeling a little cold, but okay. I woke up sometime later, not to a sound, not to a dream, just awake. The kind of sudden wakefulness that feels like something shook you without touching you. I lay still for a moment, confused. Then I noticed what was different. The rain had stopped, not slowed, stopped, completely, like someone had turned it off. And in that quiet, I could hear everything else. A drip from the tarp, a rustle of branches, my own breathing, then something else, a soft sound. Faint, distant, but there. It was footsteps. I knew that sound. You don't grow up hiking and camping without learning the difference between animals and people in the woods. These were slow, careful, deliberate, not the shuffling of a deer, not the pitter of a raccoon. Human. They were coming from the slope just beyond the stream, on the far side of the clearing. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe at first. Just lay there, frozen, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell would be out here at this hour? In the middle of the woods.
No campfire.
No light, no sound. I waited, heart pounding, listening. The steps continued, slow and spaced out, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard. They paused now and then, and I thought maybe I imagined it, but then they would start again. Closer this time. Crossing the stream, I could hear the faint splash of boots in the water. I sat up slowly. I didn't unzip the tent. I just sat there in the dark, trying to stay calm. I reached for the small hatchet I kept by my bag and held it in my lap, gripping the handle tight. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention. The steps moved to the edge of the clearing, then stopped. Nothing for maybe 30 seconds, maybe more. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a boot sliding slightly on wet leaves. Just a tiny noise, but enough to make my stomach tighten. Whoever it was, they were standing right at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. I kept holding the hatchet. My other hand was shaking. I didn't know if I should get out of the tent or stay inside. I didn't know if whoever it was had seen me or was just trying to figure out if someone was there. Then I heard them move again. A single step, then another. But instead of coming into the clearing, they turned and walked along the edge, circling around. I followed the sound with my ears. They made a half loop, then stopped again, this time closer to the side of the tent. Still not a word. Still no light. Still no clear reason why they were even there. Then I heard a sharp metallic sound, like something tapping against metal. A knife? A tool? It wasn't loud, but in the silence it was clear.
Top.
I didn't move for what felt like an hour, though it was probably less than 10 minutes. Eventually, the sound faded. The steps moved again, back the way they came, across the stream. Fainter and fainter, until I couldn't hear them anymore. Still, I stayed in that position for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there, wide awake, hatchet in hand, every muscle tense, waiting for another sound. But none came. When light finally began to filter through the trees, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The ground was slick with mud. The air was heavy and damp. Mist hung low across the clearing. I walked the perimeter. I checked the stream. I even crossed it to look at the spot where the sounds had come from. And there, in the soft mud along the bank, were footprints. Human. Boots. Not mine. They came from the trees, stopped near the stream, then turned and left the same way. I followed them about 30 yards into the woods before they disappeared into thicker underbrush. I didn't see anyone. I didn't see any gear, just tracks and broken branches. That was enough. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I just shoved everything into my bag, broke down the tent, and hiked out. Every few minutes I looked back, convinced I'd see someone standing there, but I never did. The trail felt longer on the way out. The car was still there, untouched. I tossed my gear into the back, locked the doors, and drove. Fast. I didn't tell anyone about it for a few weeks. Not because I didn't believe it happened, but because I couldn't explain it. I still can't. Maybe it was just some lost hiker. Maybe someone living off-grid. Maybe a hunter tracking something. But they didn't have a flashlight. They didn't call out. They didn't make their presence known. They just stood there watching, in the dark, in the rain. After that, I didn't camp alone for a long time. I still go out, but now I go with friends. I stick to campgrounds. I stay closer to roads. I bring bear spray and a whistle. And I always trust my gut. Because whatever was out there that night, whoever it was, they weren't out for a hike. And they weren't just passing through. I was 32 the summer I decided to take a week off from everything and just go into the woods. I'd been working nonstop at a construction firm in Phoenix, Arizona. Hot days, long hours, little sleep. I wasn't in bad shape, but I could feel the stress creeping into my chest like slow poison. So when mid-July rolled around and my boss approved a week off, I packed up my old 2006 Tacoma and headed north toward Flagstaff, away from the crushing heat and into the forests. I'd found this spot years earlier while hiking with a friend. It was about 3 miles off a Forest Service road and another mile past a barbed wire fence into a basin where tall ponderosa pines grew thick and quiet. The air smelled like old bark and warm soil. No cell signal. No sign of people. The kind of place where the only sounds were whined through needles and your own heartbeat. Just how I liked it. I brought enough food for 6 days, a big jug of water, a solar charger for my flashlight, a simple sleeping bag, tarp, and a little folding camp chair. I also had my Ruger 9mm locked in a case in the truck. Something I didn't normally bring, but I figured better safe than sorry since I'd be alone. I parked my truck behind a low ridge, away from the road, covered it with a camo tarp, and carried everything in. Took 2 trips and a lot of sweat, but I made it. I set up camp in the middle of a clearing about 30 yards across, surrounded by trees on all sides. I kept the tarp low between 2 trees, sloped it down at an angle in case of rain, laid the sleeping bag on top of an inflatable pad, set my cooler beside a small ring of rocks I planned to use as a fire pit. I didn't want any big fires, just enough to boil water or maybe roast something. That first day was perfect. Blue sky, breeze just enough to keep the bugs away. I sat and read from an old paperback most of the afternoon. Ate jerky, trail mix, some canned beans heated up. When the sun dipped low, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, noting some game trails and animal tracks. Deer, maybe a fox. I didn't see or hear anyone.
No tire marcs, no footprints.
I was totally alone. That night, I slept hard. The kind of sleep you only get far from lights and noise. The air got cold, but I was used to that. I curled up in the bag and drifted off listening to the wind in the trees. The second day was quiet too. I spent most of it wandering through the woods with a compass, just exploring. I carried a day pack with water, snacks, and my knife. Found a dry creek bed about half a mile west and followed it for an hour. Saw a couple elk tracks, a raccoon trail, and what might have been bear scat. No big deal. Nothing fresh. By the time I got back to camp in the late afternoon, my legs were sore, but I felt alive. I cooked a small dinner and sat on the log I dragged near the fire ring, watching the sky turn orange behind the pines. That night, things started to feel different. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up needing to piss. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the bag slowly, sitting up to listen. That's a habit I've kept since I was a teenager. Always listen before you move around outside your tent at night. First, it was dead quiet. Then I heard something. A branch snapped maybe 30 feet away. Not loud, but sharp. I clicked off my flashlight, held my breath. It might have been a deer, maybe a raccoon. The snapping stopped. I waited.
No breathing, no oves.
No movement in the brush, just silence. I stayed still for maybe 10 minutes, flashlight in hand. Then I slowly stood up, walked about 20 feet from the tarp shelter, and relieved myself, sweeping the light around a bit as I did. The beam caught nothing but trees and old logs. Still, I had that prickly feeling like I was being watched. I chalked it up to nerves and went back to sleep. Day 3 felt normal again. I decided to stay near camp and clean up a bit. Gather firewood, sweep up some leaves and pine needles, organize my stuff. Around midday, I saw something that made me stop. A small pile of pebbles stacked in a cone about a foot high, maybe 100 feet behind my tarp. I didn't remember it being there before. The rocks weren't native to that part of the forest either. Redder, smoother, like they'd come from a riverbed. It wasn't anything dramatic, but it stood out. I didn't touch it, just stared at it a while, then went back to camp. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the weird feeling that someone had been nearby while I was sleeping or out hiking. I told myself maybe it had always been there, or maybe an animal nudged them into that shape somehow. Didn't seem likely, but I didn't want to spiral into paranoia. That night, I loaded my Ruger and set it beside the sleeping bag. I didn't normally sleep with a gun, but the unease was growing. On the 4th day, I woke up to find the small cone of rocks gone. Totally gone. Not knocked over. Gone. No sign of the stones. Like someone had picked them up and carried them away. My heart sank a little when I realized that. I walked out to where they'd been. The ground was scuffed slightly. Light boot prints maybe, but the dirt was dry and hard-packed. I crouched and studied them. Couldn't tell much. They could have been mine. Could have been someone else's. I walked a bigger perimeter that day, 1/4 mile in every direction. No other camps.
No trails, no tire routes.
Nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling someone else had come through. I felt watched. The wind in the trees started to sound like whispers. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like quiet footsteps in the brush. Not heavy, not running, just crunching leaves and the occasional stick pop, maybe 50 feet away. I turned off the flashlight again and just sat there in the dark, heart pounding. The steps would stop, then start again. I had the pistol in my hand by then, my finger resting along the side of the trigger guard. It never came closer. After about 20 minutes, they faded. I stayed awake until sunrise. By the 5th day, I'd made up my mind to pack out early. I didn't like the signs. I trusted my instincts in the woods, and my gut was screaming now. I spent the morning tearing down camp, packed everything up in 2 loads and hiked it back to the truck. The Tacoma was right where I'd left it, still hidden under the tarp. I loaded up quickly and started down the rutted service road. About half a mile from the highway, I saw something that made my skin crawl. A pile of those same reddish river stones stacked carefully on the edge of the road. Taller this time, maybe 2 feet high, balanced neatly, right at the point where my truck tracks rejoined the gravel road. It hadn't been there when I came in. I was sure of that. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I drove straight to a gas station about 30 miles away, where I sat for half an hour inside the convenience store drinking coffee and trying to calm my nerves. I never told anyone about it. Not then. But 3 weeks later, I saw something on the local news that made everything snap into place. They found a body not far from that area, just west of the Forest Service road I'd been on. A hiker who'd gone missing 2 weeks earlier. Middle-aged guy, last seen heading out for a solo camping trip. He'd been stabbed. No gear found near him. No signs of a struggle. The body had been buried under a thin layer of pine needles and leaves. The part that hit me hardest? The sheriff's department shared a few photos they'd found posted anonymously on a forum a few days before the discovery. Creepy photos of campsites taken from a distance, clearly without the camper knowing. In one of them, I swear to God, was my camp, my tarp, my folding chair, my cooler. The angle was from the woods behind me, the direction the rock pile had been. I deleted all my GPS pins and trail notes after that. Haven't been back since. Haven't camped solo in years. Whoever that was out there, he wasn't camping. He was hunting.